Hello and welcome to my Witchcraft History. Today I'm going into the dawn of persecution. There is a popular image that the advent of Christianity as the dominant faith in Europe immediately led to the persecution of witches. The evidence, however, suggests otherwise. To begin with, practitioners of magic had been dealt with fairly harshly under Roman law, which saw sorcery as a potential threat to order and the person of the emperor. Moreover, there is some evidence that the Christian Church ended the automatic killing of witches that had been common in the Germanic tribes in Europe. The Lombard Code of 643 forbade anyone taking the life of any foreign serving girl or slave in the belief that she was a witch, because such a belief was incompatible with Christian thought. More than a century later, Emperor Charlemagne passed a law that promised execution to anyone who believed that someone was a night witch who ate men. Such a belief was said to be a delusion planted by the devil. Later still, a Hungarian king refused to pass laws against witches on the grounds that they did not exist. In around 900 AD, the church law, known as the Canon Episcopi, famously pronounced on witchcraft, linking some of the key elements that were to feature in the later witch craze: women, pagan worship, the goddess Diana, nighttime meetings, Sabbats, long journeys, and the devil. However, this legislation made it clear that, in the church's view, such events were illusions and fantasies in women's minds inspired by the devil. In later centuries, these powerful images were conjured up against the trials of alleged witches, though this time a more credulous society was inclined to take them literally. In the early part of the first millennium, someone committing harmful magic or sorcery could expect to get away with a few years of penance. However, the mood was changing even as early as the 9th century, when the Synod of Paris argued that kings had a right to punish witchcraft severely. This was based, said the Synod, on the passage in Exodus 22:18 in the Hebrew Bible, which stated that a maleficus, someone who carries out harmful sorcery, should not be allowed to live. The English king, Alfred the Great, issued laws giving the death penalty for what was called witchcraft. However, as yet, there is still no concerted attacks on witches. Only once heresy was identified as a growing threat to the church. Heresy had been gnawing at the Christian church from the beginning. There were always those, for example, the Gnostics, who were essentially Christian, at least in their eyes, but differed radically from the orthodox views of the church. Yet for hundreds of years, heretics had not been subjected to any formal persecution. The execution of the Bishop of Avila, Priscillian, in 386 was an exception to this. It wasn't until the 11th century when a group of senior figures in the church had a number of women were executed for heresy at Orleans in France in 1022. That this situation changed, and the accused were charged with worshiping the devil, of secret nighttime meetings, of sex orgies, or copulating with close relatives, of killing babies, and of drinking blood. None of these specific accusations were new. In former centuries, Jews, pagans, and Christians had all been accused of similar acts. What is striking here is how these grim images bear such a close resemblance to the accusation made in the later witch trials. They also borrow from Roman and Greek descriptions of mystery rites. The heretic trials grew in momentum in the 12th and 13th centuries, when the Bogomils from Eastern Europe and then the Cathars were ruthlessly suppressed by the Western Church. By this time, the Christian Church had split east and west, with the Eastern Church's seat of power at Constantinople, while the Western Catholic Church was centered on Rome. The Cathars, who were based in the south of France, believed that the devil was associated with all things material and fleshly, and therefore all things linked to the material world were to be despised. This is going a little far for the churchmen and nobles, who rather enjoyed their trappings of power, and the Cathars were exterminated with great brutality. They were accused of all kinds of sexual practices and even cannibalism. Again, these accusations had a familiar ring to them. Meanwhile, the Cathars' emphasis on the devil raised the profile of Satan in the church's thinking. The trials of the heretics are important to witchcraft for two reasons. First, as we've seen, they established a blueprint that could be and was later applied to witchcraft. The styles of accusations were similar, and their very familiarity to later generations would help make them even more credible as real-life witch practices. Secondly, witchcraft itself was ultimately turned into a heresy. By the late Middle Ages, witches were not seen simply as practitioners of magic. They were identified with demons and therefore with the devil. They had made a pact with the devil and therefore set themselves against God, the ultimate heresy. This explains why witches, when found guilty, were burned in most parts of Europe, because that was what happened to heretics. As far as we know, the great number of those practicing magic during the early Middle Ages were men. Certainly, there is no reason from the evidence to suppose otherwise. Much of this magic was concerned with traditional concerns that existed up to the 20th century, ensuring good crops, good weather, good health, and luck in love. These were just as much the domain of men and as of women. Yet by the 15th century, when the witch crazes began, witches were generally, though not exclusively, perceived as being women. Part of the reasoning for this went back to classical tradition, back to depictions of legendary witches such as Circe and Medea by Greek and Roman writers. Another reason was simply the development of the image of the devil. The devil, like God, was regarded as male by most Christians in the early Middle Ages. Such an important character as Satan could clearly not be a female amid such a patriarchal society. So if the devil was male, and sex was an important part of the meetings that witches held, then with whom could the devil and his male demons have sex? The answer was women. Men at that time believed women to be weak, as well as superstitious and gullible. But men also felt threatened by the sexual passions of women and believed that older women, resenting their loss of fertility as they grew older, became bitter and vengeful against men. And by the 13th century, a picture was beginning to emerge from folklore and chroniclers about not just who the witches were, but also the things they were supposed to do. They sucked blood. They had sex with sleeping men. They changed their forms into those of animals. They flew through the night and killed babies. At the same time, the legal mechanism used against both heretics and witches was tightening. By 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council had stipulated that all heretics should die if they refused to see the error of their ways. By 1233, the pace gathered still further when Pope Gregory IX empowered the Inquisition to hunt down heresy and any opponents to the church throughout Europe. 200 years later, Pope Eugenius IV gave the hunt fresh impetus when he told inquisitors how much he deplored the widespread practice of magic and satanic pacts and urged more arrests and trials. By now, most of the religious ingredients for the impending witch crazes were in place. All those who worked with magic were in league with the devil. Most witches were women. They were certainly all heretics. They therefore posed an internal threat to society and to God's will. There were, however, also other threats that made European societies think hard about their own status and security. Medieval theologians created the powerful and emotive idea that witches met at night and in secret with the devil to plan their evil acts against society, and such meetings were called Sabbats. There has rarely been a time in recorded history when Europe has not been involved in wars, both inside and outside the continent. But as the West approached the 15th century, the people of Europe had been forced to face a frightening array of threats from outside. Early in the 8th century, the Islamic Moors had driven hard up through Spain and threatened much more Christian Europe. They were to remain in Spain until they were finally expelled from Granada in 1492. Elsewhere, pagan Vikings attacked much of Europe intermittently for hundreds of years, often showing great brutality along the way, though eventually they became assimilated into different cultures. Meanwhile, the Mongols ravaged large swaths of Eastern Europe from the 13th century and from the 14th century. The Muslim Turks began threatening the soft underbelly of Christian Europe as they were to do for hundreds of years. And to this grim arrival of the Black Death to European shores in the 14th century, killing around a third of the population, and a picture emerges of a continent under siege. Even the success of the early Crusades in the Holy Land soon turned into a rearguard action as the Muslim opponents swept the Crusaders back city by city. It is perhaps not surprising that a society under threat looked for scapegoats. Among these were Jews and lepers, who suffered increasing persecution after the 12th and 13th centuries. The search for scapegoats when society felt threatened was to become a grimly familiar pattern. Meanwhile, the church had briefly felt more sure of its place in society than any other time before. The last of paganism had been ripped down when the Nordic societies finally accepted the Christian God by the 11th century. Yet the church and society was still plagued by the idea that the world could end soon, that the Antichrist would soon be among them, as the book of Revelation said. This bred uncertainty, which sometimes bordered on panic. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church was about to face its biggest threat yet, Protestantism. The emergence of this powerful rival to the established church was to cause enormous conflict and dislocation throughout Europe. Each had to prove and define itself, and one of these ways would be against witchcraft. The Apollonists of Tyana. So the early Christians had problems dealing with pagan accusations that their own Jesus Christ was simply a powerful magician in the tradition of many such powerful magicians. One near contemporary of Jesus who certainly enjoyed such a reputation was Apollonius of Tyana. Apollonius, born in Asia Minor, earned a huge reputation for magical prowess. A follower of the Greek philosopher Pythagoras, Apollonius is said to have been able to exorcise demons, cure the sick, and forecast the future. On one occasion in Rome, he is even said to have brought back to life the daughter of a prominent citizen. The Greek's life bears some similarities to that of Christ. His birth was said to have been heralded by a spirit. He was put on trial by the Romans. He appeared in ghostly form to two followers in a cave, and he is said to have gone to heaven on his death, but continued to appear to his people, teach them. Exactly how Apollonius died is a mystery, but he is said to have reached 100 years old. Interesting. I hope you enjoyed this video. I have more to come. Thank you for listening. Have a great day. Bye-bye.